So what did you check out this month?
I watched 1 Million Years B.C. from 1966. I've talked a couple times about 1 Million B.C. in these videos. This is a remake of that movie, produced by Hammer Studios. It was actually their most financially successful movie, which is kind of weird. When you think of Hammer, you think of things like Dracula and Frankenstein. You think of horror movies, but a caveman movie was their biggest hit. This is a Ray Harryhausen movie. You've got Harryhausen dinosaurs in it. But it's not a normal Harryhausen movie in the sense that usually when you watch a movie that he worked on, he's the one who came up with the story and the whole idea and kind of presented it to the studio and then was kind of behind it the whole time. In this case, Hammer said, we're going to remake 1 Million BC and we want to get Harryhausen to do the effects. So he was kind of working for hire on this movie, which is not normal for him. The commentary on the DVD made a lot of comparisons to 2001, and I probably wouldn't have thought of it on my own, but it does feel very similar to the beginning of 2001, because this movie starts out with kind of the creation of the universe, and you've got all these long tracking shots of the landscape with just the music playing over it really slowly and everything, and it's very atmospheric, and it really works. And honestly, I think the beginning of this movie is the best part of it, even though there's no animation at the beginning. As it goes on, it starts to become it becomes less interesting because you're just kind of following these cavemen around, and it's like, okay, I get it, like the movie can end now. So you've got John Richardson playing Tumac of the Rock People, who gets exiled and comes into contact with Luana of the Shell People. So the Rock People are super violent and aggressive, and they just kill everything, and the Shell People are more civilized. They also all have blonde hair when the Rock People have dark hair. And at the beginning of the movie, the narrator tells you that these tribes of people are not aware of each other, but then later they turn out to speak the same language. So I don't know how the hell that works. So Tumac and Luana fall in love and end up kind of going off on their own and encountering dinosaurs on the way. And then at the end, there's a big battle between kind of the two tribes. And then, of course, there's a volcano at the end because that's got to happen and everybody dies. Given that the only English in the movie is the narration and one use of a real word by a caveman, which is, in the movie they say Archelon, which should be Archelon, which is the name of a giant turtle that appears in the movie. Other than that, it's just cave people speaking this fictional language that they barely even speak anyway in the movie.
I was kind of hoping, since it was a British movie, the word would be blimey, or something like that.
Yeah, that could have been cool.
Bollocks.
But it's surprisingly engaging. Again, more in the first half. It does kind of wear a bit thin as it goes on. But I do think it's a good movie for what it is. And I like the music in particular. When you watch a movie with dinosaurs or monsters or whatever attacking people, you kind of think those are the scenes that are going to have the kind of exciting music come in and be more energetic. But in this movie, the music usually cuts out during those scenes, and instead you have this kind of droning sound in the background, which helps to build the tension in a different way, and in a sense almost makes it feel more kind of like they're kind of going for like a documentary feel in a way, and it adds to that because it makes it feel less like a movie during those scenes, less like what you would expect from a movie.
So the poster of Raquel Welch,
yeah,
is a very iconic poster. I didn't realize it was from this movie.
Yeah, that poster image is part of what made the movie so successful. That kind of spread around everywhere at the time that the movie was about to come out. Everybody seems to love Raquel Welch. To me, she's just a person. I don't know. I never got it. I never got the appeal personally. She doesn't do anything for me. But she's whatever. It's fine. I don't know. I watched the Japanese version of The Ring from 1998. I had never seen the Japanese or American versions.
Well, let me tell you, the American version is quite a trip, in that it's not good.
Oh, are you serious? Because I know it has a reputation for being good.
I think people at the time thought it was good, but it's very laughable.
Okay, well that's very disappointing to hear. I knew the concept of the tape that you watch that 7 days later you die, and I knew the image of the girl crawling out of the TV with the long hair crawling out of the well. But that was it. I didn't know what the movie was really about. Like, I didn't know what the story was going to be. And if you had asked me beforehand, what would I want out of a movie like that? I would have said, I want the people involved to actually investigate where the tape came from and how it works. And it turns out that's basically what the movie is them tracking back the tape to its origin. However, the movie is pretty boring, in my opinion. too much of it is just people doing research and nothing really happening.
I like how you say, this is what I would want from this movie. And it
I
did
know.
exactly that, and it was boring.
Yeah, but it did it in such a boring way. I kind of was hoping that along the way you'd have, it's...
Some Ray Harryhausen stop-motion dinosaurs.
Well, that would have been cool. But I thought you'd have maybe one person watch the tape and they would end up dying, but they'd tell somebody else about it, and each next person would get one step closer, and keep dying along the way. But that doesn't happen.
Didn't that happen in Star Trek?
What do you mean?
Where Data finally figured it out and looked at Riker's collar, and he's like, oh, we got to watch the tape 3 times.
Honestly, I enjoyed that episode more than I enjoyed this movie. I don't even remember what episode that was.
Who's the director?
I don't know. Some Japanese guy.
Because I'm pretty sure that director directed the sequel American movie, but that one was so funny for all the wrong reasons.
Well, it sounds more interesting than this one then. I'm really surprised that this has become such a kind of big, iconic cultural thing. Although maybe that's the American version more. I'm not sure. I didn't enjoy it. I thought it was boring, and then it was over.
I will say the kid in the American one was made for movies like this. He just looks really creepy.
Okay.
Like, I would see him and say, man, that kid's going through at least 4 different curses right now.
There was one time in the movie that I did laugh. This is a bit of a spoiler maybe, but they go back to when the girl was dumped into the well in the first place, and somebody whacks her in the head, and just the sound effect they used, it was one of those super recognizable generic stock effects, and it totally stood out in the worst way possible in a scene that was supposed to be serious and dramatic, and you just have like a bonk sound when somebody gets hit in the head and dumped in a well. It did not work. And that was my favorite part of the movie. I watched Prisoners from 2013. You haven't seen this movie, have you?
Describe it and I'll let you know.
This is a Denis Villeneuve movie. So now I've seen 3. I've seen this, Dune, and Arrival, and this was definitely my favorite out of the 3. And I did like all 3. You have Hugh Jackman and Terrence Howard as a couple of friends with young daughters, and their daughters go missing one day. And they basically spend the rest of the movie trying to figure out where they went. Mostly Hugh Jackman. He's following one trail of clues, and at the same time, Jake Gyllenhaal plays a detective who is following a different set of clues. And you as the viewer don't know what actually happened. So, you're kind of on the same page as everybody else, but they each are convinced that they're following the right trail. Hugh Jackman ends up doing some pretty extreme things when he thinks he knows who he's going after. And, I don't know, it's a pretty intense movie in a good way. I liked it a lot. It was a little long, but it didn't feel long in a bad way. But I would say that the last maybe 20 minutes started to strain credibility a little bit too much for me. Not so much that it ruined the movie or anything like that. I still really liked it. It was really good. I watched The Black Phone, which came out in 2022. I watched it in theaters because it has been getting super high reviews from critics and audiences. And I said, okay. So this movie was based on a short story by Joe Hill, the son of Stephen King. I had never read anything by Joe Hill before, but I went ahead and read the story because it was so short, and it felt like a Stephen King story, but it felt like one of the ones you get in his short story collections where once it's over you kind of say, well, that was pointless, I'm going to go on to the next one.
Not all of them.
No, I'm not saying all of them, but I'm saying there are certain ones like that, and this felt like one of those.
Okay.
A lot of times Stephen King will write a story because he just has kind of the smallest basis of an idea and he doesn't know where it's going to go, but he's going to write it anyway. And that's what this felt like. But there were a lot of elements thrown in that I thought were going to go somewhere, and they didn't. And thankfully I did like the movie a lot better than the short story. I was really surprised that it actually follows the story pretty closely for the most part, but all those elements that I thought were going to go somewhere in the story actually went somewhere in the movie. So basically it's about a kid who gets kidnapped by somebody who has been kidnapping kids in this area for a long time. And he's stuck down in a basement with a rotary phone on the wall, and the phone isn't supposed to be connected, but it rings every once in a while. And it turns out that on the other end of the line, or whatever, are the ghosts of the other kids that were killed by this kidnapper. And they start giving this kid, I guess, tips as to how to fight back and how to get away.
That sounds like a Stephen King story.
Yeah. In the short story, I kind of thought that there was going to be something more to that. I didn't know if it was actually happening or if it was in the kid's head. Everything's very vague in the story, and there are, like I said, a lot of details that I thought were going to be important, and then the story was just over. In the movie, you see the ghosts. I mean, the movie very much tells you this is what's happening. And part of what I didn't like about it, what I thought was pretty lame, was since it's a horror movie, or it's presented as a horror movie, they try to make the ghosts scary, but it doesn't make sense because they're trying to help the kid. So it doesn't really work. Not to mention some of those sort of like, they're not quite jump scares, but they're kind of towing the line. They just didn't make any sense because you just have the kid turn and then there's a ghost hanging upside down with like blood coming out of its mouth, and it's like, okay, why? It doesn't make sense. The kidnapper is played by Ethan Hawke, and he wears these weird masks, which were designed by somebody. Who were they designed by? It wasn't Rob Bottin. It was some kind of big name, like some kind of weird, like, I was like, that's weird that he worked on this movie. He wears these weird masks that never get explained. And again, there are a lot of details in the movie that are never explained either. And they don't necessarily need to be explained, but by the time the movie was over, I kind of said, well, what was the point of that? I still kind of had the same reaction to the short story, except that, again, it was a much better experience while it was going on. And I actually liked the stuff in the movie before they get to the short story content a lot more, which was basically just the kids going through school and the main kid dealing with bullies and stuff like that. These kids were not great actors, but they weren't terrible. I think they could have been a lot better if they were directed differently. I kind of blame the director for that, but also the dialogue in the movie did not feel like kid dialogue at all. It felt like just straight up adult dialogue, but they gave it to these kids and they said, read this and say it as if you're an adult, and it didn't work. So it was distracting, and there are a lot of fights in this movie, and these are fights between middle schoolers, but they're handled as if they're fights. It handles it like it's a boxing movie where every punch is the biggest punch ever and the loudest sound effects and just blood everywhere. And it was a little bit laughable, given that, again, these are middle schoolers.
Sounds awesome.
One detail in the story that was weird was the kid seems to keep imagining that the phone kind of inflates and deflates and is kind of like pulsing on the wall. And again, that was part of me not knowing what was actually happening in the story, how much the kid was imagining. And for some reason, they stuck that detail into the movie, but it still doesn't mean anything. It's just the phone being weird, and why? Also, in the story, the kid imagines his sister looking for him, riding her bike, and trying to figure out what house he might be hidden in. So for the movie, they said, you know what? It feels like a Stephen King story, so maybe the sister is psychic. So in the movie, she's just psychic, just because. And she's tracking him down. And, so it was the kind of movie where you're not supposed to ask questions, but I was asking questions. So did I enjoy it? It was okay. I definitely didn't hate it. I didn't think it was bad, but I definitely did not think it was anything special. It was okay. I watched a Netflix original anime from 2020 called Drifting Dragons. This anime was based on a manga, which I didn't find out until partway through, but I looked at it in the store. And I was not surprised to find that it's one of those manga that has recipes in it, but in this case it's a little bit weird because it's not a food-based story, kind of. I mean, it's about people on an airship in kind of a steampunky world who hunt dragons that fly through the air, and they sell the meat for food. And at times in the show, and I assume in the manga, they cook the meat. So the entire story stops to have characters sitting here talking about how they're going to prepare the meat and blah, 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 blah. But it's not real because it's not real meat. And then there's a whole deal about it. They make a big deal out of it. And it was slightly amusing at first, but it happens every few episodes. And it got to the point where I was like, wow, this is getting dumb. And I already was not very interested because all of the characters in the show are super generic stock anime characters. A lot of the scenes play out in super generic stock anime ways. It tries to be kind of like a slice of life anime at first, or, well, I guess really through the whole thing, but that only works if you care about the characters. And I didn't care at all about these characters. The only thing that was potentially interesting was the overall concept, but I don't know, there really wasn't anything else to it. The dragons were somewhat interesting because they weren't what you would think of as dragons. They looked kind of like fanciful sea creatures or something. They reminded me kind of like some of the things in Shadow of the Colossus, like that flying long snaky thing, or the one underwater with like the electric spikes on its back. But yeah, there was nothing else to this show. And it was computer animated in that style where they try to simulate traditional hand-drawn anime by skipping frames, and it does not look good. There's no reason to do that when you can avoid doing that. I mean, the whole reason they did that in hand-drawn animation was to, save money and time and work. You don't have to do that with CGI, but they did it anyway, and it doesn't look good, especially when only certain elements are doing it and other ones are not, and certain shots have it to more of an extreme than others, and it just felt completely random. And that the entire look of the show also was very generic and bland. So, yeah, I would definitely say skip this one. If there's a season 2, I will not be watching it. I watched Shaun of the Dead from 2004.
All right.
Yes, a 10 out of 10 movie, as far as I'm concerned. A great parody/homage to the zombie movie genre. And I mean, 2004, this was really one of the movies, I think, that led to kind of the wave of zombie movies that we got after that and that hasn't really ended. So it was coming at a time when we didn't have, zombie movies everywhere. And thankfully, they went very much in the George Romero traditional zombie route and had them be slow and everything. And this movie's really cool because it works as a zombie movie, but it's also really funny.
And I like all the homages, how they're not shoved in your face.
Yes, there are tons of little references in there.
The movie works very well, even if you have no idea of what it's referencing.
Right, and if you do, you enjoy it just that much more. Yeah, this is definitely a movie I would recommend to anybody interested in zombie movies or comedies. This is just a great movie all around. And this was Edgar Wright's first theatrical movie. And Edgar Wright is one of my favorite directors, and his style is very much already set in this movie. So if you've seen any of his other movies and you enjoyed them, I would definitely say check this one out. That's all I watched this month. I read a graphic novel called Abigail, which was based on a King Diamond album. King Diamond is a heavy metal artist, which is not usually my thing.
Yeah.
And I actually tried to listen to the album, and I didn't get very far, although it was kind of interesting in some ways. But I really liked this graphic novel. It was written by Dan Waters and illustrated by Damien Worm, which is such a fitting name, Damien Worm, for something like this. The art style was a little cartoony at first. I didn't really like it at first, but his storytelling skills are really good. The entire thing was engaging, start to finish. It felt like a House of Mystery or House of Secrets story, but kind of stretched out. Not stretched out, but fleshed out. And it was really good. It's basically a couple go to a house that the husband inherits, and his ancestor was kind of a weirdo and possibly killed his wife and all this other kind of stuff, and kept the mummified corpse of his daughter in the basement of the house. And basically it turns out that the daughter is pissed about having been mummified and everything. And when I say daughter, I mean she's she was a baby. And she wants revenge. And I don't want to say too much because if I say anything else, I'm basically going to have to explain the entire story. But it was cool. It was very dark. It was very well written. Very atmospheric. Again, engaging the whole way through. I really enjoyed it. And I wasn't expecting to, because this is something I had never heard of. Somebody let me borrow it. Somebody told me I might like it, and I did. And it was from a publisher that I'd never even heard of, and even just the physical quality of the book was way higher than I would have expected from that. It was a paperback graphic novel, but it had sewn binding and everything, which was surprising and cool. So yeah, I would recommend it to anybody who likes gothic horror with themes of possession and interfamily murder and weird mystery stuff. It was cool. It came out in 2021. I read Fortress of Solitude, which was the 68th novel in the Doc Savage series from 1938. I talked about Doc Savage a little bit before. This entry in the series was the first one that explored his Fortress of Solitude, which was mentioned back in the very first novel and pops up every once in a while, but you don't really know anything about it other than he goes there sometimes to be off by himself and do a bunch of experiments and figure out great scientific advancements or whatever. And even his own teammates don't know anything about it. But in the beginning of this story, a villain named John Sunlight discovers it, figures out what it is, figures out how to get into it, and steals a bunch of Doc Savage's deadly inventions and decides to use them to... I think he wants to take over the world, but he's at least going to pit some countries against each other and basically make money by selling them weapons. And of course, Doc Savage has to stop him. I really enjoyed this one. It was cool to learn more about the fortress and to actually sort of see it a little bit. And John Sunlight was a cool villain because he's not physically imposing or anything, but everybody seems to be afraid of him. And it turns out he has some kind of hypnotic abilities or something. They don't really go into it, but somehow he can kind of make people do what he wants, but not infallibly. There are still kind of, he's manipulating everybody into doing what he wants. And he was a really interesting character. And he's also one of the few Doc Savage villains that escapes at the end and comes back for a later story. So that's probably the one I'll read next. But I did really like this one. I think I probably said this before, but the Doc Savage stories are not well written at all. And in this particular case, when it started and you had sentences like, John Sunlight stepped off the boat onto the ice. He looked up. He looked down. He looked all around. He took some steps. He took some more steps. I kind of thought it was going to be leading up to some kind of joke at the end of the chapter or something, but it turns out no, that's just how it's written. So it almost feels like something that you could give to a kid who's kind of starting to get to the point where he's getting maybe past chapter books or getting up to chapter books even, but it's a full novel that's written like that. So at times it was funny and it made me stop and just shake my head, but in terms of content, it's a lot of fun and cool. So yeah, if you're into pulp adventure, sci-fi stuff, I would say check them out. Almost like a Golden Age superhero kind of stuff. And then I played Resident Evil 3 Nemesis on the PlayStation. I didn't beat it yet, but this was my first time going back to that in a long time. And the Resident Evils that I'm most familiar with are the first two and the GameCube remake of the first one and 4. So I was excited to go back to this one.
Are you excited about the remake of 4?
I think it's pointless. Especially given that 4 is still being ported to consoles everywhere. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'm excited, but I'm interested. We'll see what happens. I still haven't played the remakes of 2 or 3, and I still haven't beaten 7. But I was excited to go back to this one because it had been so long that it's almost like getting to play a classic Resident Evil game again, for the first time. Even though there are things that I remember, but there's so much that I don't, that it really does feel like a new experience for me. So I remember all the story and everything like that, but I don't remember the actual, points in the game as you're going through areas. And this one is really hard. This one has an easy mode and a hard mode. There's no normal. So if you choose hard, it's a challenge. At least at first. It actually does get easier as it goes on. But yeah, I am really enjoying it. So what did you check out this month?
I watched The Dark Knight Rises from 2012. And the first 2 Nolan Batman movies are always streaming on something, but not this one. I had only seen it once in theaters and remembered not liking it. So I was very excited when it popped up on Netflix this month to see if it was actually as bad as I remembered. And it was. It feels incredibly rushed. The Dark Knight has a ton of plot holes and things that just don't make sense and you have to accept it. And this is 10 times worse. And I remember reading somewhere that Christopher Nolan only made this movie so Warner Brothers would let him make Inception. So I guess it was worth it, because we got Inception. But there's so many ridiculous things in this one. I mean, Batman Begins, it feels stupid to use the word grounded for a Batman movie, but it is way more grounded than the sequel or this one. This one, you got Batman flying around in his giant bat wing jet thing. You got Bane's stupid voice that is really terribly mixed. And I think they had to re-record all of his lines anyway.
That's what I've heard.
But it sounds like he's coming out of every speaker all at once, but cranked up to 11.
That's just his the size of his personality coming through.
So even in the opening scene, you got a bunch of people on a plane, and somebody's talking, and then Bane, who you don't realize is there, starts talking, and he is on the far side of the plane, but his voice sounds like he's right next to you in the room. And I was like, man, that was jarring and unexpected. I hope they don't do that again. And then they do that for the whole movie. Every time he talks, he's like right in your face. Joseph Gordon-Levitt being Robin, but not until the last 2 minutes where someone goes, oh, your name is Robin. Wink. Anne Hathaway being Catwoman, and all of her accessories make her look like she's a cat. Just trying to keep the seriousness of the story that Christopher Nolan is desperately trying to do. Maybe he just didn't care at this point. Did David Goyer write this one too?
Probably.
Meaning that it's not good. Despite David Goyer being one of our patrons, I'm sorry. You're not a good writer.
Story by Christopher Nolan and David Goyer. He actually is not credited as working on the screenplay. Instead, it's Jonathan Nolan and Christopher Nolan.
ridiculously dumb dialogue. So Anne Hathaway's, I don't know if you remember this, but Anne Hathaway's entire motivation is getting the computer program that will erase her from every database on the planet.
I've heard about it. I actually have never seen this movie. I've seen about 5 minutes of it. It did make me want to see the rest because of how stupid it was, but I haven't actually seen it.
Oh, it's stupid. You know, he's always about keeping things hidden or putting reveals in, gradually revealing them in a slow burn. Does not happen here. So Anne Hathaway, do you care if I just tell you this?
I don't care.
So Anne Hathaway is looking for this thing called the clean slate because she's a master thief with a record, and it will erase her from all the databases on the planet. It doesn't matter how it works. And so she's working for this dude who doesn't give her the clean slate. She's like, you need to give me what I want. And he goes, the clean slate? The thing where you type in your name and date of birth and it erases you from every database on the planet, and that's what you want because you're a thief with a record? And I know you think I'm exaggerating, but that's pretty much exactly what he says.
Oh, man.
And you got Daggett, who is a Batman character, but it doesn't really matter in this case.
Wait, yeah, who is that?
One of Wayne's competitors.
Okay.
And he's the one who hires Bane, and Bane does this big stock market robbery thing, and Daggett's like, I'm in charge. Your stunt didn't work, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, I'm in charge. And Bane goes, do you feel you're in charge? And because Christopher Nolan needed us to realize that Bane is the bad guy, despite him already being the bad guy, Daggett goes out of nowhere. You're pure evil. It's so bad.
I mean, it sounds almost like a parody of a Batman movie.
Right. And there's some Nolan-esque mystery stuff. Like there's the story of the child in the prison pit and how they escaped, and you're supposed to think it's Bane and blah, blah, blah. But it just feels shoehorned in there because Christopher Nolan's like, I gotta stick some kind of reveal in here. I mean, Batman Begins, which I think is easily the best out of the three,
I agree.
also has its own problems with plot and story.
I agree.
But the movie itself is good enough overall that I'm more lenient.
I agree.
Like my favorite is Crane is putting poison in the water supply, but it's only activated if you inhale it, which is why no one has been affected so far until they evaporate all the water in the city. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
But when I'm watching it, I always think, I just made macaroni about 20 minutes ago and I had to boil water in their steam.
Yeah.
Did nobody do that? The whole family just went f***ing crazy. That's what you hear on the news.
Yeah.
I watched Replicas from 2018, which is a Keanu Reeves movie that feels like it was made in 1998. And most of it is because of his acting. I don't know what happened, but he acts like he did in something like Dracula. And you're thinking, man, how did this guy headline this movie? Keanu Reeves is a scientist who's working on taking the consciousness from a person and putting it inside of a robot body. And he's working with Thomas Middleditch, who I've mostly seen in comedy stuff, so it was weird to see him here.
Is that the guy with the weird kind of dead eye stare?
Yeah.
Okay. You can tell he has no soul behind those eyes.
And Keanu Reeves' family dies in a car crash, so he decides to use the program to put their brains inside of artificial bodies, but Middleditch is working on cloning bodies, so they're going to make complete clones of his family and stick their consciousness inside of it. And I mean, it's typical sci-fi stuff, but this was very poorly executed. There's a bunch that doesn't make sense. There's a bunch of artificial drama, just poor writing. It wasn't good. And when I finished it, I felt like I had completely wasted my time. So I don't know why Keanu Reeves agreed to do this, because he doesn't have to do things like this. I watched the 2012 movie version of Les Mis, and I'll admit my French is so bad I don't know how to say the actual full title. No es bueno, as they say over in France. I couldn't finish it.
Is this the one with Russell Crowe?
Yeah, and Hugh Jackman, and Anne Hathaway. So I think part of what made me kind of want to check it out was I think Sweeney Todd came out around the same time, which I unexpectedly liked quite a bit. And I know people really like this one, but I couldn't even finish it. The singing throughout the whole thing is really almost talk singing, It was hard for me to pick out specific songs because everything everyone was saying was in that sing-talking tone. I didn't find it very interesting. There was way too much melodrama masquerading as acting, so I really don't understand all the awards that this movie has gotten and how people talk of it so highly. I watched, oh man, see, I got an Italian one too. My Italian sucks also. I watched Lo Spietato. In English, it's called The Ruthless, from 2019, which is an Italian gangster movie about this one dude and his rise into becoming a gangster. And it was cool. It was a little slow. A lot of scenes felt unfinished, like the whole movie could have used more polish.
What made you decide to watch this one?
I think because I had read a comparison to Scorsese stuff. Someone said it was like an Italian Scorsese film, which some of the subject matter was the same, but the whole style was not. I watched Pan from 2015, which is a Peter Pan prequel, also with Hugh Jackman. Seems like we both had a lot of Hugh Jackman in our list this month.
Yeah.
It was not very good. It was a big spectacle movie, really pandering to little kids, it felt like. A lot of big CGI scenes. Garrett Hedlund really not acting well.
What else is he in? I know that name.
Tron Legacy is what I know him
Oh,
from.
that guy. Yeah, okay.
And his acting wasn't great there either, but here it's just bad. So it's this kid who's going to become Peter Pan, and it's kind of a mix of things from Hook, but just visually. And like I said, it was pandering to little kids. It felt like some executive was like, whatever, kids are stupid. Who cares? Just make a movie. Put some bright colors in it. And I'm trying to think of what kids like. Put some bright colors and stick a Bop It in there. And they'll be like, ooh, Peter Pan. You watched Police Academy last month. I watched Police Academy this month because I've never seen it.
That was like a year ago at this point, but okay.
Oh, shit. Well, whatever. But you were spot on in pretty much everything you said.
And I only made it halfway, but that was because they took it off of Tubi, I think.
I don't understand how this movie spawned a freaking franchise.
Yeah.
So, I'm not going to talk about that. If you want to hear about that, go watch whatever freaking month you talked about that. I watched The Irishman from 2019, which I had seen before when it came out. And it's a Scorsese thing, coming back, I guess, to more of his classic stuff. And it's not as good as something like Casino or Goodfellas, but better than newer stuff like The Wolf of Wall Street or Shutter Island. Felt more cohesive, and I'll tell you, I've expressed this before, but it still holds true. CGI de-aging does not look good. I know people think it looks good, but it doesn't look good. And people saying, well, it's the actual actor. They don't have to make a CGI person. They might as well. It would look the same.
Yeah, they're basically just getting the actor's motion capture. What you're actually looking at is not the actor.
And I watched a little making of thing they did in conjunction with this movie. And you got De Niro, Pesci, Pacino, and Scorsese sitting around a table just talking about the movie and whatever else they want to talk about, which was okay. But Pacino is just gushing about the de-aging techniques and how it's brilliant and how he couldn't imagine anything better and whatever. And I was just thinking, shut up.
Well, he's really learned how to, promote his propaganda after having worked on those Adam Sandler movies and stuff. He knows how to really push it at this point.
I watched Semi-Pro from 2018, which was from that string of Will Ferrell movies where he decided to just make a movie about every sport. And this one was definitely one of the bottom tier ones. It wasn't even that funny. It was just trying to bank on Will Ferrell being in it. The less said, the better. I watched John Carpenter's Vampires from 1998. Have you seen that?
It's been a long time, but I have seen it before.
This was my first time watching it, and it's 1998, so we're talking later Carpenter, so I went in with mid-level expectations. It was not very good. James Woods is the main dude, and he's the leader of this group of vampire hunters, and he's trying the whole time via dialogue and body language to be this badass.
You didn't mention the sunglasses.
Even in dark rooms. He's not a badass. He comes off as a guy desperately trying to be a badass, and you think, well, maybe it's his character at the end. He'll say, oh, it's all like a facade, but it's not. He goes through the whole movie like that.
I remember thinking the way they would kind of harpoon the vampires and pull them out into the sun was cool.
Yes. The only cool part, really for me, was special effects for the vampires exploding once they got exposed to sunlight. Oh, I forgot. James Woods, his group has a priest with him, and every line of dialogue that James Woods spits at this guy, he has to use his name. But he doesn't actually use his name. He just says Padre. And I could see, oh, maybe this old priest has been with him a long time. But even after he recruits a new priest, he immediately just starts calling him Padre. Every line. The movie felt weak.
I know it was based on a book by a guy named John Steakley. And the only other book he wrote was a sci-fi book called Armor, which I have read, and I really, really like Armor. But I haven't read Vampires.
Maybe I'll check out the book then. I watched Identity from 2003, which is based on that Agatha Christie story, 10 Little Indians. It had potential. The movie setting is a hotel where 10 people show up.
I remember seeing the previews back in the day and thinking that movie looks like it could be good, but then I forgot all about it until just now.
And it could have been good, but it just seems like the movie didn't know what it wanted to do and didn't know how to resolve itself, so it eventually decided to just explain everything outright, which ruined the mystery aspect of the mystery movie. So you got John Cusack, you got Ray Liotta. That's all I can remember. And I'm going to throw out some spoilers here, so if you really want to watch this movie, first don't. So it turns out none of it is real. Even the characters are fake because they're all personalities of this dude who in the real world murdered someone, and his psychologist, who might be Alfred Molina, I can't remember, has set this whole thing up because one of the 10 personalities inside is a murderer. So the hotel setup is a psychological experiment where all of them are getting killed off, and the hope is the one that's a murderer will die, so then the actual dude will not be a murderer anymore.
Oh, man.
So the setup had potential. I was engaged, but then they just throw everything out there at like the halfway point. And I was like, wait, but there's half of the movie left. Is there going to be something else? And the answer was no. I watched Get Smart from 2008, that Steve Carell movie that was a remake of the TV show, which I've never seen. The movie was not very good. Steve Carell had a few funny jokes, which was unexpected. He can be funny, I just didn't think he'd be funny in this movie.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
The rest of the movie was throwaway. Overall, it felt like I, as the viewer, was on set watching them make a movie, not watching the finished movie itself. Everybody seemed to just be, well, I'm at work acting, so let's do it, I guess. Oh, were the cameras running?
I think that perfectly describes a lot of comedy movies that came out around that time.
Yeah.
A lot of those Will Ferrell movies as well, Adam Sandler movies, like all that kind of stuff.
I watched Super Mario Brothers from 1993, which if you haven't seen and you have any interest in seeing it, I would recommend watching it just because it's so weird. It's so out there, especially considering the source material. It was at the time when Nintendo of America was in its early stages, and the parent company in Japan was a little more loose with all the licensing and how things were presented. So the movie has virtually nothing to do with anything you would think of from the games. It's like a complete reimagining, trying to make it into a 90s action film. It's creative, I'll give it that. And it definitely does not belong on those lists of like worst movies of all time, especially video game movies. There are video game movies that are a lot worse than this one.
I agree.
I think it's worth watching one time just to really let it sink in of how loose everything was back then.
I agree. The whole movie is very unique.
And let's get this straight. Neither of us is saying this movie is good.
Correct. There's some genuine creativity to appreciate in the making of the movie, in the fact that they put it together the way they did and just some of the elements in there. It doesn't really come together in a completely cohesive way or anything, but it's an interesting movie.
The production was completely off the rails, as you can find from any interview talking with anybody who worked on or in the movie. Some cool special effects. I really like that Yoshi dinosaur.
Yes.
And I remember finding some grainy-ass VHS documentary somewhere on YouTube where they showed how they did it, and it was so cool. I watched Hitman from 1998, which is not the one you're thinking of.
Okay.
It's a Jet Li movie that came out over here as Contract Killer. It was so good. It was the perfect late 90s kung fu action movie that I was so happy I found. With ridiculous stuff and early Jet Li, so before he was like a super name, And it almost felt like kind of a Jackie Chan light movie. It was that kind of movie. The plot is exactly what you'd expect. So there's this big, rich CEO conglomerate dude, and he gets killed. But right before he gets killed, he tells this assassin, hey, you better watch out. And of course, I was watching the dub because it didn't have subtitles. So it was that much better. Whoever did the dub really liked doing dubs and had a good sense of humor. Because there's a bunch of side characters that are just off in the background talking with the goofiest voices ever. And you know they did it on purpose.
Okay, you're definitely intriguing me with this one.
Yes, you should watch it. It was very entertaining. So the CEO says, hey, just so you know, if you kill me, I've got this deal set up that whoever kills you gets $100 million. But then he gets blown away anyway. And we cut to his son, who is psychotic, and his lawyer and whatever. And they're just talking about the revenge fund. And the fact that this dude had a whole revenge fund set up was awesome. So they hire all these killers, and they're all competing for this $100 million. And Jet Li lives in this apartment, and he's just like a farm boy with other people who all want to be hitmen. But they all talk about it so casually, which is really funny. And they're all just regular people. And he ends up falling in with this con man who serves as his agent. And of course, Jet Li's really good at fighting. And so he's going to find the king of killers, and he's going to take him out and get the money. And there's some really good fight. And there's, of course, the really goofy people. Like, there's this super tall guy. He's got to be freaking 7'5". And he doesn't talk. He kind of grunts and growls. And he has these rings. And, oh, yeah, on the tips of his shoes, they're there, too. And it's these flashing lasers that blind you. So he'll go to punch Jet Li, and Jet Li will block him. But then the ring's right in his face, and it goes whoosh. And then Jet Li's like, ah, and then he like can't see.
Oh, man.
And it just happens the whole fight. It was so good. It was awesome. I'm so glad I found it. It was in the same vein as something like Black Mask, which I also really like, before Jet Li kind of went his own way, which I didn't really like.
Doing his serious historical movies.
No, the stuff in between of like Lethal Weapon 4. No, I like his historical stuff. And the last thing I watched was Beavis and Butthead Do the Universe, which was from 2022. Mike Judge coming back to Beavis and Butthead, and it was good. It felt like a real follow-up to Beavis and Butthead Do America. And there were some recycled jokes, but it was still funny. I read the last 2 volumes of Jack Kirby's Fourth World Omnibus, which is 1972 through 1973. And after reading the first 2, I was really excited, and I knew his Fourth World stuff kind of got cut off, but it really got cut off. It was so disappointing to see how everything just ended. And you could tell he didn't want to do it that way, but he was kind of forced to. So like the Forever People, when they taru together or whatever, they switch places with the Infinity Man. But then Darkseid had banished the Infinity Man to somewhere else. And the Forever People were thinking, man, we're in some dire straits right now. If we could just summon the Infinity Man, everything would be better. But we can't. But maybe we can. And the Infinity Man is trapped in wherever Darkseid put him. And he's like, oh man, I can sense the thoughts of the Forever People. Darkseid didn't plan on his barrier blocking thought waves. And then he makes it out just because they were thinking about it, which I would think they would think about it every time. And then the Forever People end up in that dimension, and they just walk off into the distance. And they say, well, let's see what's out there. And that's the end of the Forever People. The New God stuff also ended abruptly. It was such a slow burn of reveals for Darkseid and Orion and how everything was going to turn out that also felt incredibly rushed. In that last issue, Jack Kirby threw in probably 35 reveals that you could tell he was waiting to really stretch out. And then that was over. The only one that went on was Mr. Miracle, and I think you said it was because it was more of a traditional comic book hero thing.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
But even that felt very rushed. And then the last one of that, he and Big Barda got married. And then all of the New Gods people showed up at the wedding, even the villains. But not to break up the wedding, just to say something ridiculous like, the source said we should be here, so we're going to witness it.
Oh, jeez.
It was so dumb. And then Darkseid showed up at the end and was just laughing a lot. And then it was like, Mr. Miracle is over now too. And the 4th volume also includes the issue that he did in 1984, which was practically 10 years later. So in the 1980s, DC decided maybe the sales numbers weren't so bad back in the 70s, so they reprinted Kirby's New God stuff and let him write a last issue to close everything up. And that's in quotes, because it also felt incredibly rushed. And it was 10 years later. Kirby put so much of himself in those stories in the 70s, so him trying to get back in that mindset did not work. There's no good solution. Well, really, the good solution would have been to not cut it off back then. It was almost a waste to have this one 10 years later. It also includes The Hunger Dogs, the graphic novel from 1985, which was, I guess, another attempt to kind of close everything up, which also didn't work. The art for that is also not nearly as good, even though it's still Jack Kirby. But all the characters, having Darkseid have freaking pupils in his eyeballs was weird.
Yeah.
The fact that Darkseid is taken aback and shocked at least 4 times, because that's not Darkseid. Darkseid's always standing there with his hands behind his back, saying, I actually know everything, and I'm not going to bother telling everybody, because what's the point? And in this one, him falling backwards in surprise onto his butt. At the end, Apocalypse rises up against him, because what has happened over the course of these 10 years is Apocalypse went from being based on cosmic energy to machines, which Darkseid himself enacted. But he has resentment towards it, which I don't understand, because he was the one who told everyone to start doing it. And all of the ways of the warrior and the honor and tradition and everything have gone out the window, which is unfortunate, because you get someone like Granny Goodness, who in the Mr. Miracle stuff was such a badass, and you knew meant business when she showed up, and in this one, her and the Female Furies are basically the butt of everyone's joke, and they're not angry about it. And you think, oh, they're going to like get back. They are a joke, saying stupid things and doing stupid things. It was really unfortunate.
Yeah, that sounds disappointing.
So at the end, Darkseid's making these bombs, and it's micromatter or something like that. It's basically equivalent to splitting the atom, but in fourth world terms. And they send one of them over to New Genesis, and Highfather intentionally sets it off. You don't know that at first, but it destroys New Genesis, which is why all the fourth world stuff, the new gods were on their floating little city, because that's what survived. And he did it on purpose because he knew the big flaming chunks would rain down on Apocalypse and freak everyone out who was living down there, which it does. And all of the hunger dogs, which are the slaves and everyone who lives down there, has to work under Darkseid and everything. They say, oh man, that one bomb just blew up that whole planet. Oh shit, the bomb factory is 2 blocks that way, and there's like 1,000 bombs in there. Let's rise up against Darkseid. It was so stupid. And Darkseid gets away in his little jet car, shaking his fist. And I know there's fourth world stuff after that. I know some John Byrne, some Walt Simonson, some Jerry Conway, and I want to check that out. I wish Jack Kirby had a chance to do what he wanted to do for fourth world. I read the Liminal Zone, which came out in 2021, which is the newest Junji Ito manga. And I think it's funny, because in the afterword he said, I'm running out of ideas, guys. These 4 ideas were from a notebook I found under my bed. But they were pretty good. And maybe why they weren't used in the past was he wanted to make them longer than what the page requirements were back then. But for this one, he didn't do it as a book. He did it for an app, so he can make it as long as he wanted and actually stretch out the story for the length he felt was appropriate. So they do feel a little bit longer, but they were good. And I played the House of the Dead remake from 2022, which I'm surprised was made at all. Supposedly, Sega has lost the source code for the original game. That's not surprising to me, because a lot of shit back then just seemed to go missing, not just for Sega, for everybody. The game is super short, pretty much an on-rails zombie shooting thing. I like the alternate routes. I did it with somebody else, which I think is much better than doing it by yourself. And I know that studio wants to remake the second one too, and I hope they do, because that was the game where things really kind of took off for that series, I think. And plus, I mean, they made the Typing of the Dead, which really motivated me as a kid to learn how to type the right way. And I played Monster Hunter Rise. I kind of got back into it, which originally came out in 2021, but that new Sunbreak stuff came out. But they've been releasing DLC for quite a while, free stuff. So I finally caught up to Sunbreak, and I'll probably buy that. And that's all I did this month. So, thanks for watching again.
And stick around for more of these videos in the future.
We're actually recording this in July. Yeah, I know we say, I hope they remake House of the Dead 2. They'll probably be on freaking 3 by the time this comes out.